So if everybody could share their names, their pronouns, connection to New Beginnings, potentially if you work at New Beginnings or if you're a supporter, if there's anything you want to share around that. And what's a good, a personal myth? What's something people are surprised to find out about you? So names, pronouns, your connection to New Beginnings, and what's something people are surprised to find out about you? Well, while you are thinking, I am your host for today. My name's Neba. It's pronounced like you'll never forget it. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm the community engagement manager here at New Beginnings. So I really love providing trainings, just having conversations in general around relationships. What's something people are surprised to find out about me? People are surprised to find out that I'm an introvert. One thing I love about my job is that it is in community engagement, and it gives me a very big share of social energy. So when I am done working, when I'm done spending time with people, I really recharge on my own. So without my personal alone time, I can't do this job well. Part of my internal alone time is self-care. So I'm gonna copy and paste the items for our warm-up and our check-in in the chat again, so folks can check in.
And Neba, are you saying like to put it in the chat, to say it out loud?
You can choose either or. We would love to hear your voices, because hopefully we'll be talking lots today.
I'm happy to go and check in. Hi, everyone. My name is Asia. My pronouns are she, her. My connection to New Beginnings is that I'm the new executive director. And I've just moved to Seattle, and I am so excited to be in community with y'all. Something people are surprised to know about me. Neba, what you shared resonates, but I would say that I love to sing, most specifically like old jazz standards, like Etta James or Ella Fitzgerald, big, boomy. I love to sing. It is one of my deepest joys in life.
I can go. My name is Mish. I use she, her pronouns. I am one of the prevention educators on the social change team with NEBA. And I think people are surprised when they find out I am only 4 feet 9 inches tall, because sometimes they are generous and guess 5 feet, but I'm not even 5 feet.
I'll go. I'm Jenny Ware. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Home Safe Program Director. And I've been fortunate to work at New Beginnings for many years and feel so grateful for the work that we do. I think one thing that some people might find surprising about me is that some years ago, I went bungee jumping and rock climbing. And they would find that surprising because I don't seem that adventurous to some people, but I do have that side of me. And that summer, I just decided to embrace it, and I had wonderful experiences.
I'll go next. My name is Paige Plus. I'm the donor relationship manager at New Beginnings. One surprising thing, Haley, you were surprised when I told you that I worked on an archaeological dig right after college in southern France. It was storybook wonderful. So that's mine.
Did you find anything?
Yes, we did. We found shards. It was a 9th century church at the bottom and an 11th century cathedral at the top. And a farmhouse was sitting on top of it with one of the buttresses coming off the side. Pretty exciting. It was Aigues-Mortes area, southern France. It's called the Camargue. It's very interesting. Yeah, we found bones. We found a lot of stuff. It was fun.
I'll jump in. My name's Haley Hansen. My pronouns are she, her, and I work on the development team here at New Beginnings. And something surprising, I'm certified in scuba diving is something I don't know if people know about me. I haven't been in a few years. It's kind of like a warm water thing, so I don't get to do it a lot around here, but my dad and I used to on vacation, like when I was a kid, we'd go scuba diving together. So kind of a dormant hobby.
I'll go. My name's Rachel. I use she, her pronouns, and I work on the hotline, the DV Hopeline. And one thing surprising that people, would be surprised finding out about me. I'm gonna pick kind of an obvious one that, not an obvious, but funny to me because my identity used to be like so revolved around that, but I actually used to be a classical musician for like and like it was a whole past life, and now I'm reborn as a domestic violence advocate.
What did you,
Oh, go ahead.
what did you play?
I played oboe.
My name is Alex, he, him. I actually know Rachel, and she invited me to this thing. And I was kind of going to say the same thing as her. Like, I used to be a professional flutist, which is how I know Rachel.
That is pretty cool. My sister learned how to play flute. So I thought that I would follow her big footsteps, and I did not practice. Like, my family made me quit band because they're like, we can't pay for your flute if you're not going to practice.
It's not to be pessimistic, but it's not worth it. I think a different career is better.
Wait, potentially last question. What's something people are surprised to find out about you, Alex?
Oh, the flutist thing was kind of what I was going to say.
Cool. Well, I'm really glad that we're all here today. It's just going to be a relatively informal chat. Everybody has a chance to jump in. There's no set structure on like who can speak at what time. But I have about 5 myths that we can work through. And we'll just see how many we get to talking about. If it's feeling like a good transition time, I just might check in to see if we want to move on to the next one. But a really just open chance for us to ask questions, get to like know how each other thinks. So basically, I'll just have a statement that I'll put in the chat and I'll say it out loud, and then we'll take some time to think about it and just express our thoughts on like what that myth means, looks like, feels like to us. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Let's get started then. So our first myth is that if a person is abused and they hit back, they are just as bad as the person who's abusing them.
I definitely feel like I get calls about this all the time where the caller is saying, you know, like we're abusive to each other, or they're saying like, you know, yeah, he hits me, but I hit him back, or that kind of thing.
I was going to mention, I feel like we see this kind of mindset reflected in the schools that we work in with, for example, zero tolerance policies that will punish, you know, both people who are in a situation where one person might be defending themselves or simply like backed up in a corner, feel like they can't, they have to fight back in a way. So I definitely think that this is something that's ingrained in youth from an early age of that, like, you know, if you defend yourself, that's just as bad.
I think this myth fails to take into account the complexity of power and control in what we see central to abusive relationships, and that kind of quote unquote fighting back, that all violence is the same violence type of thing, where it doesn't really understand the depth and complexity of power and control center in our issue advocacy space. Just kind of a thought I was having about that.
That particular myth too can make it really more challenging for some survivors to feel that they deserve support or reach out for help because they're doing some self-blame or, you know, analyzing their own actions too much, not looking at the whole pattern of power and control and who's trying to exert that power. And that's really unfortunate that it might restrict some survivors from reaching out for support.
I recently had someone at a community event. Oh, I'm trying to remember which one it was, but they had recently talked to me about, they're like giving me a very specific case around a person who had to kill their partner in order to leave their relationship, and was like, is that okay? Like, why don't people get help? And I was like, you know, I'm not, part of my, like, part of the way I see things is not so much why did this person have to respond in this way. It's like, why did this person create such harsh, violent conditions that, like, the only way for somebody to leave might be to defend themselves. And I think I liked what you said, Asia, around like, if we have a critical, like, I think about how we need to have a critical lens towards violence, because oftentimes, like, we really like to use the intimate personal analogy with institutions too, around, you know, if like, when we think about colonialism, there's a large body of activists who talk about how if we're resisting those forces, we have to take some power back. We have to use tactics that the system that doesn't self-check itself recognizes. And somebody who's being abusive, who can't really understand how to stop, you know, it's not going to stop any other way. So that's why I think it's really important to do prevention, because we really don't want people to be in those situations.
One thing that was talked about a lot in some of my earlier trainings when I was just starting out and as an advocate was this idea of not looking at DV like a snapshot, like a photo, but looking at it like a film. And so, you know, if you're, say, a policeman arriving on this scene to see that, like, there are scratch marks on this guy, you know, you're not seeing the whole film, which is like, you know, this whole pattern of power and control that has been leading up to this moment where, you know, this person had to defend themselves. Yeah.
Has anybody heard of like the idea of like a perfect victim? Like the idea that if some like people in order to like be understood as survivors, like often have to play to a victim narrative where like it's like as if you have to do nothing if somebody hurts you because otherwise you wouldn't be believed. Because then people believe like, oh, well, you're capable of violence too, you know? And it because they theoretically think you can't, if you hit back, you're like, well, you could have done that the entire time. Like, why didn't you do it earlier? Why did you pick this time? And so I think oftentimes people who are survivors, in especially women, are pitted as being really cold and really calculated when they finally defend themselves, even though we know that people who experience violence often have to think about defending themselves strategically. They can't do it when they're always being hurt. And so I think it often paints the picture for some people that like this is somebody who like did it premeditatingly, you know, if they really wanted to leave, they would have. And so there's a lot of shame.
Yeah, I was reminded of the case of Centoya Brown, who killed her trafficker, her abuser. And one big, I think, point of contention that people harped on with her was that she shot him while he was sleeping. And a lot of people are like, why couldn't she just have left? Like, why couldn't she just have gone to the police? And it's like, yeah, when you don't take into context the circumstances that led her to feel compelled to defend herself that way, like, and not including like considering the intersections of race and the criminal justice system, you know, like it really paints an incomplete picture. Yeah, and I appreciate that in our line of work we can apply a more critical eye, like it's been said, to violence in general and just be able to put it into context.
Are we ready to switch to another myth? Okay. Myth 2, domestic violence is very different from sexual assault and other forms of sexual violence. I think on just like a person who's been in this field as like somebody who works here, I feel like we all know that this isn't true. And yet, like our system and our support network is set up that like we're called a domestic violence agency, but then there's another agency for sexual assault support, and somehow that we work differently than another. So I feel like sometimes even if we might not believe this ourselves, like the ways that we work in this field can perpetuate it.
I definitely feel like when I'm, talking to a domestic violence survivor over the phone, at my work, I feel like this is my turf. This is what I'm familiar with. This is what I know. And as soon as somebody calls in who primarily identifies as a sexual assault survivor, I suddenly started thinking, oh, this is, yeah, I'm out of my depth. This is different. I'm not sure, what all of the things that are like that might be going through this person's head or that they might be experiencing. Um, I'm not sure that I know what those are, but yeah, I think you bring a good point of like it's all under that same gender-based violence umbrella, but somehow I've kind of put them in two different silos in terms of experiences.
I think our cultural kind of relationship to sex is informs, I think, how sometimes we think we need to show up for sexual assault survivors. And and this isn't an indictment of anything really. I mean it only to say that what we know should be true about the role of power and control when working with survivors of domestic violence is that to meet them in that space of shared power and empowerment. And it, of course, we know that that isn't different for sexual assault survivors, but I think that there can be sort of this like cultural aspect that informs how we show up to survivors of sexual violence that may not always serve them from that place of empowerment. And so I think that Neba, your point of challenging, separating that, and I think I feel invited then to get critical about who is maybe at the center of that decision to separate those, victimizations or experiences. And is it this person who's experienced harm? Are they really at the center of that decision for that like sort of systemic separation? So thank you for offering that. It's given me something to think about as well, because we know these violences are not separate. To reiterate that, just wanted to echo it.
Well, I think also just like not even in the nature of the violence itself, they both come from a very gender-based source. And also we know that from the stats, most people who experience a form of sexual violence experience it from an intimate partner. And so it's really common that, and also knowing that sexual violence is common in general in our society, that there's probably a good amount of survivors who are coming to us who have experienced it as well. There's just a big overlap.
I was going to mention the victim blaming is very prevalent and similar in both sectors. As we talked about in our last myth, like just with regard to domestic violence, people will ask, why the survivor didn't leave or call the authorities or, get a divorce. With sexual assault, I think we see a lot of similar, just like, why was she wearing that? Like, why did she get so drunk? Like, she could have said no. Like both of them have such stigmatized perceptions in our society, that while there are nuances between them, like they still need like that same sort of like destigmatization, kind of tackling of it.
I feel like that very much goes back to there's no such thing as a perfect survivor. And just for all of those things above, just like thinking critically about like, what is a survivor supposed to look like and how similarly those questions are tackled by survivors of domestic violence and survivors of sexual assault.
Yeah, I have done some presentations before on topics that involve sexuality. I have done like a safer sexting presentation and I love doing it, but it's really hard sometimes to do it in organizations that where, especially in a culture where we feel, if for example schools a little bit more equipped to advertise healthy relationships groups, but it's really hard to get a school to really validate and understand that like talking about healthy sexuality and holistic sex ed is just as valuable. I think, you know, we have this idea that it can be supercharged to educate teens on engaging each other in healthy ways, but for example with the safer sexting presentation, I provide alternatives that people can use and ways to like have tangible harm reduction in like and how they might want to use digital devices to engage with people sexually and flirting and sexting. And I recently worked with the Shoreline teens at Shorecrest High School, who they have a club called the Sexual Assault Committee. They want to become peer educators on consent. And they talk about how the sex that they're experiencing is not holistic, how it almost forgets that relationships are part of sex too. Like they aren't getting taught about the reasons why people want to have sex. They aren't being taught about all the different forms of sexual violence that are out there. And like, we don't do that either. In our curriculum, we talk a lot about power and control, and we have like a warning sign wheel that we can break down different forms of violence within those, but we don't have a session that names different forms of sexual violence for people to be able to identify it while it's happening to them physically, emotionally, digitally. Should we move on to the next one? Myth 3. Toddlers are too young to be impacted by domestic violence.
Well, we all know the ACE study exists, the adverse childhood experience modality, you know, just thinking about witnessing violence at such a developmental stage in your life, like really increases the cortisol levels in a young child's development, and that physically rewires your brain, like changes it so that you're super hyper vigilant. Your attachment styles are affected with your parents or your guardians. You know, if you yourself are subjected to that violence, whether directly or indirectly, like, yeah, that's really impactful. And that I think it's really easy, at least for people in my parents' generation, to think like, you're too young, you won't remember that, or like, we provided you a roof over your head and food for you, and like all these other you know, baseline needs, like that shouldn't have affected you the way it does. But clearly we see that trauma is long lasting and physically impactful, physically and mentally impactful.
I know that it can be really common for toddlers to, I mean, they're, kind of trying to emulate like everything that their parents are doing. And so, that can branch out to things like, hitting a parent or that kind of thing. And even if they're young and they're so small that they, can't actually hurt you, but it's still, striking to see that behavioral change, because like that's what they see around them. If physical domestic violence is something that's present in that relationship, that's just one example.
I think this is such a hard one to talk to survivors about sometimes, survivors who are parents. I know our youth and family advocates at Home Safe really try to do it in a very compassionate way, because they know that toddlers are not oblivious to what's gone on. And yet we also don't want to add more guilt and stress onto the survivor who's then left the relationship. So trying to focus on the resiliency and the protective factors, while also just acknowledging that there has been an impact, and to be aware of that and to support children in whatever ways can.
Yeah, I really like what you said about like not making someone feel guilty, because I think especially parents who are experiencing the harm in a domestic violence relationship are often guilted by, why didn't you leave? Because you're kids. Even though one of the reasons why they might stay or choose not to leave is because they want to keep their kids safe, because leaving can escalate some danger. And so I think that a lot of times parents have this big guilt around like, oh, well, like this thing happened. And, if I hadn't done X, Y, Z, like, what if my kids didn't experience this? And like, I don't want to talk about this with my kids. Because sometimes I think there's a fear around naming something and having to acknowledge that it's real, and that it might need more work than, the 1 or 2 days that you're talking about it in. But a lot of times having open, honest conversations with young kids about what's happening, even when they're toddlers, so that way they build an idea around something isn't healthy, and like we're doing something to change that, are that it gives kids language to be able to communicate their feelings earlier and to interpret their relationships. I think if we don't talk to them, they can get really confused about what happened. Am I lagging, by the way? I just felt like I saw.
I might have seen your video live just a little bit a minute ago, but I don't know if that's showing up on anybody else's screen. So it's not your audio though. You're fine.
Cool. I actually had somebody at a conference I just did talk about, they thought that their toddlers, because their children were 3 and 2 at the time they left, that they would be okay. And they were really frustrated that their daughter was going through similar relationships. And she was like, I've always asked her, like, why didn't you learn from what you saw growing up? And it was just this really interesting conversation around intergenerational trauma, and how we often aren't the first people in our families to experience issues. And unfortunately, unless we do a lot to change things, which I believe we can in this world, right? Unless we do a lot to change things, we might not be the last. The next myth is you can't really do much to help the person until they leave the relationship.
I feel like I get callers like this all the time who are just like, supporters, loved ones of survivors. And the first question is like, I'm trying to support them to leave, but they won't leave. And I don't know what to do. Because I feel like we've all just been taught that, I don't know. Yeah, we haven't been taught about like all of the barriers to leaving. So, there's all of that rhetoric around like, yeah, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just ignore them? Why don't you just, all of that kind of thing. And we know in this organization that there's so many barriers of why a person can't leave, and it can be finances, it can be a picture in your head that you've had since you were little of a family being two parents and kids. It can be the danger of leaving, and it can be some mix of all of the above. So these are all barriers, and there's so much that I feel like people can do around those barriers, but I'll stop there for now.
If that myth were true, it would really belie the important work that our CAP program does and that our DV Hopeline does, because amazing work can be done to support survivors, whether or not they ever leave. And we've had survivors that have planned for years how when they're going to leave, if they do leave, how they're going to leave, and to get support along the way, how to stay safer while they still are living with a violent person. There are so many different ways to support survivors. And that also just seems to state that domestic violence happens in this vacuum. We're talking about survivors' whole lives, and there are a lot of life-generated risks versus domestic violence generated risks, and survivors need to weigh those sometimes. And sometimes the safest thing for them is not to leave at that time. It might really increase their danger. So I think the work that we do outside of working with those who have actually left a relationship is just so very, very important. And I'm really glad that our community years ago put a lot of resources into those community programs.
I'm really glad that you said that, because I feel like the most meaningful calls that I get on the hotline are the ones from people who it seems like it's their first time reaching out, and they just need to hear like, I believe you, you're not crazy, that you're not alone. What is happening to you is so real, and whether or not however you choose to continue with life from here, like, we are always here to listen and not judge whether you leave or you stay, because we know that both choices are equally valid.
I really appreciate that you said that we don't judge how people choose to navigate their relationships or leaving them, because so much of the questions and curiosity I get is like, how do I get this person to leave? How do we? And I've always explained it where in an abusive relationship, through acts of abuse, whether they're emotional, physical, or sexual, one person maintains power and control over the other person. And as much as we don't like that, if we're going to tell this person, you have to leave, and judge them and stop talking to them because they're making these decisions, we're actually now the person who has power over them because we're making the choices for them. And so I really encourage people, if their loved one is going through this, to really build some empathy, to build some patience, to learn about how domestic violence impacts somebody's health, well-being, why survivors stay, to really, really get familiar with that. Because if you can be there for someone and support them as they make this decision, what every decision they'll make will be something that they independently choose to have. And they will become an independent person. They'll learn how to make their own choices, because part of abuse is breaking down someone's individuality. It's breaking down someone's personal self-sufficiency. It's breaking down someone's independence. And if we treat this person as if they're just this object that we can make decisions on how they live their life, we're not really any different from the person who's harming them. And so I just really focus on individual skill building and really making sure that person's safe as much as possible, like Jenny said.
I'll add one point on the prevention side of things. We, or at least I, see a lot of our students. We like to do like we like to ask them, like, how would you help a friend in an abusive relationship? And so many of them, at least before we teach the groups, like we'll say something like, tell them to break up and tell them to leave their partner. And yeah, it's just, it really needs a cultural kind of education on, talking about like how leaving an abusive partner is one of the riskiest, most violent times, most dangerous times for a survivor. And, them not leaving immediately doesn't mean that they're doomed or that they are implicitly enabling the abusive relationship or that they can't be helped. And yeah, I just think it's really nice on the preventative side of things to kind of deconstruct that with the kids, with the students, and encourage them to think in terms of supporting their friends consistently throughout the process, and not jumping forward to just immediately ending things.
Well, I think that also reminds me of like, we do a boundaries activity with them. And like, I think one thing that I really like to affirm with teens is it's okay to be curious, or it's okay to maybe like see, a lot of times I think people, when they're leaving relationships, they're considering it. There's a lot of curiosity around, like, if I leave this relationship, what would my life look like? Or if I stay in this relationship, what could this be like? And so I always talk with teens around, like, it's okay to be curious. It's okay to feel like you're not ready to make a decision yet, and that you want to get a little bit more information about, is your relationship changing or not? And one thing that we do is we really help with trying to be mindful about how they're feeling and expressing boundaries based off of that. Because I think if we can take the shame and guilt away on like whether or not somebody's going to leave, and really focus on like knowing how they feel in that relationship and being able to act on that, then we'll see people who probably want to, leave maybe earlier and are able to like understand that feeling, or able to like communicate why they aren't leaving, and able to like, focus on those reasons. But if you're like judging someone, they're not going to open up to you. So our last myth of the evening is myth 5. Police should be everyone's number one contact in danger.
I will say one more thing. Yeah, in terms of talking with the students about how they would help support a friend. This is also another common answer that they put down, is to immediately call the police or call 911. And it gets really interesting when we talked with them about like the treatment of Black and brown people by the police, or of queer and trans folks, and how just the police as an institution have exacted so much violence, and really in a lot of cases just enabled violence to continue happening, whether that be with domestic abuse survivors, or other marginalized groups of people. And it's been interesting in terms of deconstructing that really ingrained idea in the youth that the police are the good guys, and that they are always to be relied on. You know, they are the ones who will protect you. But I'd like to think that with Black Lives Matter, with Me Too and other social justice movements, like the students of today have become really in tune to like being more aware of systemic injustice and systemic abuses of power, especially with regard to the police. So yeah, that's just something I wanted to mention.
One part of potential police involvement too goes back to what Rachel was talking about that domestic violence is not a snapshot, but rather a film, and police have to make a decision on a snapshot sometimes, which results in a lot of survivors being arrested because they might look like the primary aggressor. And, you know, it's just crazy. Domestic violence is so complex. Nobody can step into a situation and understand what's been going on for days or weeks or years and make a determination. So, you know, it's just much more complex than that. And a lot of survivors have felt the harsh reality of police not being their number one friend.
I think also if we think about like in our society, people might assume that this is the natural automatic connection. Like, you know, we have kids who are writing call 911 because it feels like we are really culturally ingrained to see it as the number one service, but it didn't always exist. Didn't always exist in our world. And humans have existed for a long portion of time, not saying that we've done it right ever, even today. But that is to say that we're constantly building new things. And so I really like to challenge people's imagination and thinking, if we had these things that didn't exist all this time, what else could we have? You know, what else could we create today to have in our future in 10, 15 years, if not earlier? And so there's another, I guess my mind did not say this very cleanly, but I have another thought that I'm just going to go into. But oftentimes people's assumption that police will be the number one incorrect contact, I think, is because people have a view of what danger might look like. And it really reinforces this idea that danger is always going to be physical, and that it's always going to be something that can be physically intervened upon with police. But we know there's lots of danger that happens that might not be easily called for police, where people are emotionally being manipulated, where people are being digitally exploited, where people, for example, I'm just thinking about a situation where somebody's going through intimidation. Their partner is like telling them that they're going to hurt them, but then they go to the police and the police is like, well, call us when they hurt you. Like, and we don't have any way to involve ourselves. So oftentimes, you know, this idea that police should be the number one contact in danger is in such a high crisis situation that at that point I'm like, there should have been other resources that would have been the number one before we got to this dire situation here.
Yeah, Neba, to your point, I think that we don't often, when we're talking about domestic violence or our sort of maybe larger understanding around it, is that when the physical violence has happened, not always, but is often an escalation when other tactics of power and control and coercion aren't working or aren't perceived to be working by the person who's causing harm. And so when I come into contact with a participant or survivor who has experienced physical harm, I'm often left curious where the missed opportunities for supporting that person long before that physical violence has been a part of that equation. And I think to Jenny's point also, like, that's why New Beginnings is so vital to supporting people who are experiencing this harm in our community, because we're set up to connect and support much earlier in that cycle. And I think that, yeah, I just want to echo the importance of that work that our programs are doing to support folks at every stage of along the cycle of violence.
We also have a Hopeline that is 24 hours, 7 days a week. So Rachel, I don't know if you want to speak any more to like the crisis calls you get, but we are a resource that exists for anybody out in the community at any time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so like Neba said, we're a 24-hour line, and we don't only just provide referrals, we provide emotional support and safety planning as well. So yeah, as a possible in between from like 0 to 911, this can be a really great resource. And it's not only survivors who call, but other providers, supporters of survivors. And I know that I'm always so happy to hear from, people who are supporting the survivors, because we really like to say that like those folks are like very make or break. Like if you have people who are on your team, it just makes, staying safe or staying safer in that situation so much easier. But regardless of whether anybody watching is a survivor or a loved one of a survivor, like, don't hesitate to give us a call. And I'm sure that the number is going to be put in the notes and everything. So I'll just leave that to you.
Well, I think Alex, you're technically our only non-New Beginnings staff community member person with us. We're really glad that you joined.
Yeah, it was good to be here, and it was really interesting and informative. I know I've heard about some of it from Rachel, but it was good to hear some other perspectives, I thought, and it's interesting to hear, like, I suppose, cultural norms around domestic violence and relationship violence and abuse challenged a little bit. And like, there's always, the cultural like idea of what something is, and then the reality of what it is. So thank you for putting this on.
Thank you so much for attending. I want to also thank all of our New Beginnings staff members. I really appreciate you showing up to chat, especially Asia. I know that as a new executive director, there's so much on your plate, but I think it's just nice and sweet to be able to have open discussions about these common nuances that are in our field.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here, and I hope to attend a lot more in the future.
Well, if anybody has any last comments or questions, please feel free to ask. I see that it's about to be 6:30. But I'm going to turn the recording off. If you have any questions, we'll just chat about it off the record. But